We're now live on YouTube with the November 10th edition of the NPM biweekly feedback auditing session. Whew, that's a mouthful. How are y'all doing today?
Good.
Great. So I'm going to take 1 second to just quickly post this link on Twitter so folks can follow along at home if they want to. So thank you for being patient if you're already watching. Okay, cool. So that's done. Let me go ahead and screen share the agenda. And then we've got Darcy helping with notes. So thank you very much for that, Darcy. So this is our feedback repo for folks who it's their first time tuning in. It's a place where people can come and open discussions to talk about feature requests or improvements or various different things that they'd like to see improve across our suite of products that we offer at NPM. If it's something that you're interested in doing, making some suggestions, there's some documentation here about how to get started. In here, inside of the discussions itself, you'll notice we have the agenda for today's meeting. We have a whole bunch of other discussions that have been opened. And at the top here, we've got a how to give good feedback discussion that you could look at that has some instructions on how to open a productive discussion if you want to get involved. And then we've also got this meta feedback topic where, like, if you've got feedback about the feedback, please feel free to come and bring it here. I personally love meta things, so this works really well for me. And then all of the stuff in feedback is meant to help come in and improve our public roadmap, which is available here. You can see our official roadmap of things that we're working on right now, things that we have slated up for next quarter, things that we're thinking about exploring in the future. And we'll talk a little bit more about this during our agenda. But for right now, I think maybe what we could do really quickly is quick introductions to everyone on the call for people who are just tuning in. That's like 5 seconds or less. I'm Miles. I'm a product manager at NPM and also on the Node TSC. Darcy?
I'm the engineering manager on the NPM client and work closely with Miles and the rest of the folks here and contribute to a bunch of open source projects, including Node and a bunch of the working groups there as well. So,
awesome. Thank you, Darcy. Ed?
I'm Ed Thompson. I'm a product manager at NPM.
Awesome. Ed's also one of the maintainers of libgit, but, which I find super cool. Marav?
Hi, I'm the Director of Engineering of NPM Registry.
Thanks, Marav. Roy?
Hello, I'm Roy. I'm a software developer in the Fly team, and I'm also a contributor on Node.js.
Wonderful, thank you. And Scott?
Hi, I'm Scott. I'm the least important person here. I'm Senior Director for Packages, NPM, and Pages at GitHub.
Wonderful, thank you, everyone. So for those tuning in, I put the wrong time down at first. So I'm just going to own that I made that mistake. So if you meant to tune in and tuned in an hour early, that's my fault. Sorry about that. But here we find ourselves now. We have an agenda for today. The process of the agenda is I go through all the discussions. I keep this kind of running list, and then I look at the list and I turn into broader topics when we have lots of discussions that are touching on similar topics, or sometimes when there's one discussion that's very timely and I feel like we should discuss it as a group. For this week, we have a couple different items, and I wanted to start by kicking off a quick recap on package metadata review. So the big agenda item that we spent most of our time talking about 2 weeks ago was improvements to package metadata. We identified a number of different ways that we could fix package metadata, and we've added stuff to the roadmap. Ed, is there anything that you'd like to add about this before we show the updates to the roadmap?
I don't think so. I think short of just saying like we're excited to do this work. No, I think that the updates should speak for themselves for the most part.
Okay, cool. So looking at the roadmap, there's lots of things here for the quarter, but the things that have been added based on this feedback include show download usage by version, which is pretty cool, where we're going to aim to, rather than just showing all downloads, we're going to show downloads per specific version. We're still working out some of the specifics. It's especially, you know, like it's a little bit of a challenge figuring out like how to do the design and which data we have collected right now. We're scoping that work out right now and hoping to have something this quarter. We have used GitHub flavored Markdown instead of what we're using right now for READMEs within the repo. And we also had, I think we have one that hasn't gotten on there yet for adding TypeScript information to a package, which is pretty cool. Oh, it's down at the bottom? Ooh, okay. I'll move it back up.
Bad.
No, all good. Yeah, and then show TypeScript information for packages that have type declarations. So, you know, none of these are massive changes for us, although some of them may take more work than it looks like on the surface, which is, you know, how these things always turn out. But I think the general hope here is that these small things that we refer to as paper cuts, and we talked to at the top here of shipping 10 features and bug requests created through public feedback. The hope is that, you know, lots of these kind of small tweaks can significantly improve the experience. So that's kind of like a follow-up to the work that we talked about 2 weeks ago, things that we have on the agenda for this quarter. Does anyone from the team have anything to add before we move on to the next item? Cool. So the next item that we have on the agenda is improvements to 2FA and publishing and tokens. Ed, because you launched the Npm Automation Tokens last quarter, would you like to quickly introduce this topic?
Yeah, so the idea behind an automation token is that it's a type of token that you can use, and as the name implies, it's meant for automation scenarios like CI and CD workflows. And the idea is that you can protect your user account with two-factor authentication. You can require everybody who maintains the package that you are working on to use two-factor authentication. But you can have this automation token that doesn't require two-factor authentication. Generally, access tokens in the NPM registry require 2FA. So, you know, when you run npm login, it'll actually get you a token. And when you run npm publish, it'll use that token and it'll prompt you for your one-time password. So you need to go to your authenticator. And that's great for interactive workflows. It's not so great for automation workflows like CI and CD workflows. So the automation token removes the necessity to use 2FA, and so it's perfect for these sort of automation scenarios. But it's not perfect for everybody, right? There are larger packages and organizations that want still more bespoke requirements around publishing, and so totally makes sense. And I'm really interested in the ideas that have come up from the feedback.
Yeah, so there are actually two items that we already have on the roadmap based on this feedback. One is registry package scoped automation tokens for publishing. So that's what Ed was referring to there, where like, and this makes sense. It's like for some users, they own hundreds of packages. They don't want to have a token that they generate that has access to publishing all of them. So one thing that is definitely on the future for us to explore, but we haven't yet slated that work into a particular quarter to like promise to deliver it, is having these per package scoped automation tokens. Another thing that folks have asked for, which is related but a little tangential, is staged publishing. So the ability to like have the publish process go to a certain point and require human intervention for the last step. Now, in some ways, this is, you know, possibly able to be done with cleverness and GitHub Actions or something like that, or like your own stack. There's some really cool solutions for some of this in the ecosystem, such as Wombat Dressing Room. But I do know that there's interest in kind of like a more blessed official approach to this, and it's something that like we definitely want to explore as well. So we've put this in future. And it's part of the reason for having this on the agenda today. We just wanted to speak to it, make it clear that, hey, like we've heard these requests. We agree that this is work that we could do. At the moment, especially with launching automation tokens, we think that like kind of the 90% case for this is fixed, or at the very least, like people are now unblocked in being able to publish via CI without turning off 2FA. but we do also know that there's improvements we need to do. So I thought that this would be a good example of kind of showing y'all how, like, you know, sometimes we agree and it's like this work needs to be done, but we just don't have a timeline on it yet, unlike some of these like website improvements that we were talking about earlier. Cool. So the next one that we have, oh, wait, actually, I guess before I go on, does anyone have anything to add on 2FA and publishing and tokens?
I'm just wondering if like something like the easiest one here is like the naming NPM tokens. Is that also on our backlog right now?
We do not have something tracking on the roadmap for naming the tokens. Ed, do you have any context on that?
Right now, so I'm going to use GitHub as the example, but right now, if you create an access token on GitHub, you're asked to give it a name so that you can identify it in a list. That doesn't happen if you create an access token in NPM, either by the CLI or the website. And so what we actually show you is just a list of redacted tokens. So you see like the first couple characters. It's perhaps not the best scenario. It would be nice if you could specify a name and a description maybe, so that you could remember what these tokens were used for. I agree that it is probably very easy, although I hate saying that as a product manager, because I do know that there's an API here, and there may be compatibility issues with older versions of the CLI. And so I'm a little hesitant to call it trivial, but I agree it's probably not too bad.
Would it maybe make sense to add something to future with exploring so we just don't lose the work item?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me add a note, and then we can turn that into an issue afterwards. The registry naming naming tokens. Would that be good? And I guess the other one that did come up here that might be worth adding too, if I recall, Ed, there was a request about like the who am I endpoint, or specifically about like, let me see if I can find the discussion.
Yeah, the who am I endpoint needs to work for automation tokens.
And then someone was also wanting to like verify the validity of the token. Would you be okay with adding registry who am I endpoint for automation tokens?
Yep.
Okay, I need to dig a little bit more into the verifying the validity bit before I think we could, like, because I don't totally understand the scope, and I'm not going to like rack my brain around that just in this meeting. So let's wait until afterwards. But so those are two items. We'll flesh those out as tickets. And then we'll go through and answer the discussions that requested these with a link to the issues that are tracking that work. So we're now getting on to the next issue for discussion. And I think this one is probably going to take the meat of our time in the discussion today. It's a hardy one. So what is our role as the steward of the registry? And what role do we play in certain scenarios where packages are either abandoned or namespaces are squatted? What is appropriate for us as far as, you know, like when we can step in? And like, there's a lot of history around NPM's role here, and a lot of policy that has been drafted based both on like expertise and wisdom, but also on experience and scraped knees. So we need to be really careful about it. There are three different topics that have been opened recently that kind of touch on this in different ways. One specifically, that was someone asking what happens with abandoned packages. And they were specifically talking about a package called Trim. And Trim has a CVE. It is not significantly a problem, if I recall correctly, and we can look at the vulnerability information. It is like a 7.5, it's high, but if I recall correctly, I think it is having trouble reading this CVE right now because I don't know all the acronyms. I think it was, oh yeah, it's a regular expression denial of service. So like, that's not great. You don't want to be having DOSes, but it's also like, this isn't a remote code execution. This is not something that's causing like super massive issues, compromising people's computers. It's not malware. So it's not like we need to act immediately. But the person raises and says, hey, you know, this package trim has 3.5 million downloads. There's a PR open to fix it, but there's other open PRs that have been open since 2016. And the last PR that was actually closed on the repo was from 2014. And so this was pointed out much more as like a use case, again, because the severity was not like that extreme about the vulnerability, but the question was like, what should NPM do in this case? And at least for myself, I know that like I struggle because, you know, handing over the keys to someone, especially if it's not someone we know and trust, is potentially a bigger security vulnerability than the regular expression hack. The other thing here too that was pointed out is we do actually have a documented process here for resolving these kinds of issues. And this process is for like when there's an abandoned package, when you would want to adopt a package created from your project, but published by someone else. So like someone published a package of your code. If someone's squatting a name, or if someone's like deliberately misleading and confusing people with the package name, we have this kind of like dispute process that goes through, you know, like all the different steps that you would follow. This also includes trademark disputes. So we do have this. But at least like my impression that I've heard from external people in feedback, and I'm not saying that this is 100% the case, but it doesn't feel like our policy is as transparent as it could be. And some people have had inconsistent experiences with it, which I mean, makes sense because we have to handle it on a case-by-case basis. But I think at the same time, it might be worthwhile for us to kind of think through how we want to handle this policy, what this process should look like, and like decide, hey, you know, like at what point would we actually do something? And so that leads to another example that I wanted to bring up, and then I'll open it to the room, but it's packages that name squat on built-in modules for Node. So this is one where I thought it was like pretty clear. So I wanted to present these together first. So it's like, there's an HTTPS package, which is 6 years old. HTTPS is one of the modules in Node. If you npm install HTTPS and try to require HTTPS, you're going to get the built-in in Node all the time. Unless there's some times where you could not get the built-in, which we don't want happening. But we can see this module still has like 236,000 downloads a month. And if we look at prior art here with the crypto module, we could see that the package has actually been deprecated because it's a built-in in Node, and it's kind of being held to avoid malicious use. Similarly, if we look at the FS module, we have a security holding package. And if I recall correctly, but I could be wrong, I think historically there was actually a time where NPM removed the FS module from the registry. But as you could see, it's downloaded almost 1 million times a week. So when they just removed it from the registry, it actually broke a ton of stuff. So like we're in this weird position where we can't necessarily remove it, but you can see that they published a new version of it. And I'm assuming that that new version of it has like nothing, and it's pointing towards the security holder. So we can see that these things are kind of inconsistent, but we can't make a blanket policy. If we look at buffer, well, this is a module with 25 million downloads a month, and it's a polyfill for Node's buffer API used by Browserify. This is something that I myself have used in production. So kind of like stepping back from this a little bit, I think that in this case, we probably should go through and do audits of all of like the Node built-ins and potentially have like a clearer policy around that and not allow publication of these kinds of modules. But it is one of those things that like, even when it seems to be clear, we do really need to think about it on a case-by-case basis. With that, I'd love to kind of put it to the room and the folks we have on the call. Like, what are your thoughts about this? Like, what is our role as stewards here? When should we step in? Do you feel like our policy is sufficient, or do you feel like we can make policy improvements?
Miles, can I ask you a question? If you would put your Node hat on for a second. So I think that the example that you used of HTTP and crypto was, sorry, HTTPS and crypto was excellent. How does Node roll out new top-level modules? Like, do they consider existing packages as part of that, or how does that work?
Yeah, so it's actually very contentious. This is why I'm giggling. So we do pay attention to like what already exists in the ecosystem, and we generally will not land new modules that are existing packages generally. But like I think a really great example would be HTTP2. So the HTTP2 module existed before Node landed HTTP2, but it was broken by Node 6 and was never fixed on Node 4. And I think it was in Node 6 or Node 8 that we landed HTTP2. So whatever the order of operations was, we landed as a Semver major. We generally land new modules as Semver majors, but not all the time. Sometimes they're minors. But in that case, because there was another module, we landed it as a Semver major. And the ecosystem module wasn't even working on the new version of Node that had the built-in. And we had an agreement with the person who owned the namespace that they were going to stop working on it because there was no need to anyways, because Node was going to do a built-in. So that's an example of one that was like semi-contentious. In other cases, we look at the ecosystem and we just like won't name something. So like a really great example here would be our zlib library, which is technically a generic compression because we have Brotli in there now too. So if you want to use Brotli compression, you actually have to do like zlib.brotli. But I use that as an example to show like we really should have a compression library, but there already is a module called compression that is a part of the Express ecosystem. So one thing that we've been looking into doing is creating a Node namespace, which works now in ESM, but not in CommonJS, where you could do node : and the built-in's name. And I think that we may in the future look at creating a policy where all built-ins go only into the namespace and aren't exposed on the flat namespace. So like NPM owns the flat namespace, so that's kind of like contentious. That was a long way to answer your question to say it's similarly on a case-by-case basis. We do research every single time. The fact that we don't own the namespace actually becomes a reason why modules don't land quickly. And we're looking at a long-term solution that would actually have us using our own namespace, not sharing with NPM.
So if Node went that way, then this would be less of a problem.
Yeah, it would be less of a problem. I think in general, like for right now, for that specific one, we probably should just go through and do an audit. Like the number of modules that exist in Node Core are finite, and we probably could just go through, do a list, come up with the ones that are being used, come up with the ones that are abandoned. But I think like this is where applying policy consistently becomes an interesting challenge. Should we, I mean, like, do we just go in and take over the ones that are obviously a problem? And why would this be any different than other potential security vulnerabilities on the registry? Why should we act here when not acting in other cases?
Well, we do have policies around dispute resolution. Like we do have a process around that. And we have language specifically around ensuring that like, that we try to resolve essentially confusing name squatted like modules, right? So like there might be a precedent that we could create here where, you know, if something is considered abandoned, then yeah, we can essentially go through the same process anybody else would. And again, like just use the policies we have today. Like I think they cover this basis.
But I think the point that you're making, which I think is important, is that like even though we are the stewards, we shouldn't have like, aside from the cases of like obvious abuse, but then I guess like that becomes a line. But like when, like, should we get an escalated like ability? So like if we get like a takedown notice that there's a module that's malware, we would act really quickly and just take it down. We probably wouldn't go through like a dispute process where we wait 4 weeks. I'm talking in hypotheticals right now because, yeah, but where do we draw that line? That HTTPS module has, in my personal opinion, 0 actual use cases. It is just a problem that it exists.
So I mean, I guess I look at the policies that we have today that, like, if we went through the process, that would probably be the outcome, is that we would see that we would agree with that, but there'd be a time frame and there'd be the ability for the existing owner or maintainer to also, you know, claim that there's some usage that they have that's unique, or, you know, like going through that process, I think would like ensure that nobody feels like they're involved along the way, right?
So I guess with that in mind, just as like one kind of action item here, I feel confident that this is work that should happen, and I personally would like to do that work. Would anyone have a concern with adding it to the roadmap? And if we did add it to the roadmap, do you think that's something that we should do this quarter, or maybe push to next quarter because we have a lot of work on our plates already, and it's not like super time sensitive? It's more just going to make me itchy.
The work you mean is like doing a full audit of commands
Of built-ins.
Yeah, of built-ins.
Yeah.
I mean, I have no problem with queuing that up. It's a lot of like probably a lot of make work and a lot of like going back and forth. But yeah, I think Merav, you were going to jump in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there is some engineering work to do here around the audit. So we need to have a more discussion to decide if we can do this this quarter. So let's put that note and have that more discussion.
Yeah, because I guess, and maybe that you could tell me if this is what you're thinking. There's we audit them and come up with a list of the ones that are there. That helps us today. But from like a registry perspective, how can we avoid this long term and kind of automate that process? Is that what you were thinking, or?
No, I'm mostly thinking what we have right now. Like this will have to have some tweaks in what we have right now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was planning to literally just like Node has a module that lists all the built-ins. So I was just going to write a script that just like generated all the links and then manually go through all of them and just say which ones we own, which ones we don't, which ones look problematic, and then create a list of ones to open tickets about. But let's dig into that more.
Yeah,
let's not live.
Take this offline. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. But I think that's
like in this topic though, like it is worth mentioning, and you and me spoke about this a bit, Miles, earlier, that it does somewhat connected to the PQN that we had conversation, or the metadata that we had conversation last week or 2 weeks ago, sorry, where if we have better visibility, maybe also on the status of each package, when we have like better understanding the scoring and like the maintainership, might also worth like people will have a better understanding if this is actually abandoned, or like if this is actually being used, is just actually been maintained in a better way. So we can actually have, you know, a better understanding what's happening with these packages if we have better scoring and better visibility on that, which will already prioritize it. So.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, because what even means abandoned? And that was something Merav and I were talking about extensively this morning, because, and also what does maintained mean? Because there are packages that haven't been touched in 6 years that just don't need to be touched. They're done, which I know for most software developers is a term that doesn't really exist, but sometimes, especially with really, really small things that do one thing, something can actually be done. And if we look at a lot of like the streams community, or even just like a lot of the really, really early Node things that were like almost just like small polyfills, things that have ended up in the platform, but like just like really, really small things. I think that's even a really good example, is like some of these polyfills. Well, those are ones that could maybe be abandoned, but like really should never be worked on anymore, because all they're doing is like deferring to the built-in internal, and it's like mocking that API for modules that relied on it. But we want to make sure that like we have a consistent way of saying that something is abandoned is like one bit. And then the other bit is like, when is it appropriate to hand over the keys? Ed and I were talking about this, and I was using the example of like a friend of mine, Matteo Collina, is a very trusted developer in the ecosystem. He sits on the Node.js TSC. He's one of the maintainers of Fastify, which is like gaining a lot of popularity as a server-side platform. If he were to open, he actually, instead of like saying hypotheticals, if we look at this abandoned package thing, Matteo literally did come in and said he's been using it a few times and it's great. So this to me is actually like the thing that I wanted to point out here, where it's like we have some maintainers who are coming in and saying, I'm aware of this dispute policy. I've used it before. It's worked really well for me. And these tend to be people who are like seasoned developers who have been in our ecosystem for a long time. But then we have other people coming in saying like, how do we even do this? And other people asking like, hey, I'd love clarity on how to do this process. So I guess like one of the things that I want to make sure of, and maybe this is worth like a broader policy review, is I want to make sure that we're consistent with the policy and we're not creating unnecessary tiers or castes within our developer community. We need to be fair about how we do this, but then the flip side, and it's hard, is a lot of times when we're talking about security, it's deeply intertwined with trust. And so you don't want to hand over the keys to things that you don't trust people for. And as stewards, I guess we need to be like consistent, and we can't allow personal relationships to muddy the waters there. And I'm not implying that that is happening at all, but it's like, we do need to kind of figure out like, what are the cases where this would be okay? What are ways in which we can make trust transparent or consistent? And honestly, if there are times where we should be handing over the keys, or if alternatively, in lieu of something that's going to break the ecosystem, we tell people, fork it, which I mean, in many cases is treated as like a big no-no in open source software development. But like realistically, if there is a thing that has lots of downloads and it's not being maintained, the most appropriate thing that you can do, in my personal opinion, is fork it, re-release it yourself in ways that are respectful of the original license. And if you build enough of an adoption of your thing, either that becomes the new thing, or potentially, the person who ran the old thing is willing to hand over the keys. But like, you need to build that trust. And I definitely have seen conversations in the open source ecosystem around various projects that are not well maintained, where, like people come by who have not worked on that project, who do not have these personal connections, who are kind of like expecting things to run faster and just want to be given the keys right away. Maybe we're getting a little bit into the mucky muck there, so I'll step back a bit. But I think that like where we become, it's challenging for us is like, as the steward of the registry, we are kind of the referee here. So like, how do we make sure that the rules that we're playing by are fair and consistent? And I think fair and consistent is in some ways at odds with networks of trust. So I don't know how to balance that. Anyone have any thoughts about that?
I don't have a solution, but I agree with you. I think that this is important. I don't like the notion that we might be capricious about this.
Mm-hmm. So would people be up for maybe a meta like revisit policy for disputes and claiming abandoned packages?
Yeah, I think the policies need to be updated either way. There's a couple things in there that need to be updated based on recent changes. So.
Yeah, I think you'll see some of those changes land in short order.
Yeah, but yeah, no, I agree. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I guess there was one other one in here we didn't get too much into about like audit or validate certain unique details of the package JSON. And this was like kind of touched along a whole bunch of different things. One of it was that like the code that was on GitHub didn't actually match the code that was on NPM, and was very confusing about what actually got published or who actually published it. I was also talking about the case where there's a package that wasn't maintained and got forked, but now there's like 3 forks of it that are all maintained in different states, and they don't know, well, which one do I use? And so they were interested in seeing ways that we could address scenarios where like the main package isn't updated, the main package has an issue and requires a solution. The solution can't be merged into the main package and someone wants to publish that solution. And so I don't know that there is at the moment things that are actionable outside like from the specific things that were pointed out here. But this discussion might be one that's worth kind of reading as well to think about, well, what are other places where we could improve this and where are some of the gaps? I think both from like a documentation standpoint, like the information we provide to people about like, actually maybe that is it, is like defining what our role is here is something that shouldn't be ambiguous and is maybe a bit ambiguous because people are not clear about that. Okay, any last thoughts before we move on to the next topic? Okay, so the next one that we have on here is login and authentication, and we had two different issues about this. So like currently authenticating with multiple registries can be difficult, and there isn't a clear path that we have right now for supporting single sign-on. So there is one discussion that was opened by M pointing towards an RFC that has existed for almost a year over on the RFC repo about ways of doing browser-based authentication from the CLI and just kind of like problems that they've run into without having like good browser-based authentication and the improvements that could be made to developer flows here. So that's kind of one of them. And Ed and I both kind of went back and forth with M, and just as like an update from our end is like, I won't speak for Ed, but at least for myself, I have a gap in my understanding of OAuth and like exactly what the work area items would be here and what to prioritize and when it makes sense to land things. So we are in the process of doing research with engineers to make sure that like we totally understand the space before pushing for any particular changes. And I think you also had some thoughts around like the work that this could create for multiple registries.
Yeah, and again, this is primarily driven by my, relative naivete when it comes to authentication mechanisms. But yeah, like if we propose a change that is, well, we need to change every client and we need to change every registry, that's going to be a tough sell for a lot of people. So, but yes, broadly speaking, like ignoring the implementation of this, yeah, I'm very bullish on this. I just think we need to figure out how we need to do it.
Cool. And I guess like what quickly ties in with like browser-based authentication is this other issue that got open discussion. We didn't have too much discussion, but it was just about like login with GitHub. And so Bonds asks, like, it would be fantastic if the website supported GitHub as a login mechanism. The service is owned by GitHub, but they were wondering if there's plans in the future for progress. It could allow NPM GitHub package registry packages to also be listed on NPM. 2FA is already set up and required for some organizations on GitHub, so it could allow for user access and organization and registry on NPM, and just like other things that we could do integrating between the services. I guess I'm gonna take a moment here and be radically transparent, and then all of my colleagues can tell me whether or not they agree. But many discussions that we had since I personally joined NPM were about order of operations of doing specific work items. And authentication with GitHub is definitely a work item that is on our radar. It's a pretty obvious one that we would want to do. Like, we have these two things. Why wouldn't we want them like working closely? There's all sorts of cool things that we could do. You have login with GitHub. Now, all of a sudden, for example, we generate authentication tokens for each of your packages, and they're automatically there in actions for you, making publish easy, right? Like, this makes things more secure. It makes it easier. It fits directly into other things that we're getting asked for. At least for me, this seems like an obvious win. As we were going through and planning work for this quarter and the work that we're doing right now, though, we wanted to make sure that like we had the fundamentals solid. We wanted to make sure that our ecosystem knew that like our roles right now are to be good stewards of NPM and good stewards to the JavaScript ecosystem, and prioritize, you know, what they need as a community before we necessarily prioritize what we think is cool or like what's best for our business. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't prioritize those things as well. I think that this login with GitHub is definitely like, it's definitely something we're already talking about internally. It's something I could see being on the radar for next quarter. And there's discussions around that. But a lot of the reasons for the planning and the timing here was very related to like, we want to focus on like the fundamentals. Let's get the registry fast. Let's improve reliability. Not saying it's not reliable, but like you can always have more nines. We collect them like Pokemon. We have these small paper cuts like you've been seeing us talk about today, just like things like the registry, the versions, TypeScript information. There's so many like small things that we could work on that just make things better for people. So we wanted to like focus on a slew of these first and just kind of show where our priorities are. Do folks have anything to add to that for right now? Kind of like about that concept, either like kind of the meta of us as stewards, or more specifically about like GitHub Auth and why you think it might be cool?
I can just say that it seems to me it's just like another auth type for us in the CLI. So like our default is like the legacy auth strategy. And if we ever introduced login with GitHub, we would look at it as just, I think, another auth type from the CLI standpoint. Which is exciting because it doesn't sound like it's that crazy to work on, so, or that like tough to add on to. So just to say I'm excited if we ever do it.
Anyone else have anything to add about this? Either the SSO website-based login or the GitHub Auth stuff for right now? So I think that it might be worth putting a note in future here about this, but like maybe meta explore authentication with GitHub. I like framing it this way because it's more about like the research part of the work as opposed to like what the work itself would be. Because I at least for myself, I don't think I have a full grasp of exactly what this could look like. Because there's, well, we can authenticate, but then like, is that connecting accounts? Is that like, how does this like connect your repos? Like there's so many different odds and ends there. I feel like this is like an exploration piece first, followed by like more discrete work items. Does anybody have any thoughts about framing it that way for right now?
I think that's exactly right.
Cool. Wow, we're going to get through this whole agenda. This is wild. So I'm gonna be radically transparent one more time. We have this last agenda item for frustration with CVEs and audit. And we have a topic where we've been having this discussion specifically about noise. You know, like we used to not have any insight into what's going on with CVEs. Now we have too much insight and they're not always useful. So it's like when there's too much noise, you don't pay attention is kind of like the high level of it. And people want a way to either like minimize the amount of noise or control the flow. Now, I think that we could discuss this one as a group today. But we do have a security expert at GitHub, Maya, who we've been talking to about this and has come in and participated in the discussion. Unfortunately, Maya had a conflict today and was not able to join. I'd like to propose that we skip this topic for today and invite Maya to the next meeting and have a broader conversation with an expert on the topic when they're able to join us. Does anybody have any concerns with that or any last minute bits they want to add for that for right now? Very cool. So we've got 10 minutes left and we've got this slew of additional topics. Now, one thing, we do have 2 of the CLI team members here. Would it maybe make sense to go through this list of topics, or are there specific topics in this list that anyone would like to talk about that they're passionate about? And if I need to make it bigger for you, just say enhance and well, you know what, I won't even wait. I'll just do it.
I haven't dug into each one of the CLI ones, but I'm totally okay with speaking to them at a high level.
Okay. So maybe we could start with a quick update on workspaces.
Yeah, so we've been discussing the details of sort of the next phase of work for workspaces in the RFCs repo. There's 2 open RFCs that I know Roy, who's on the call, has proposed, and we've had really good discussions from and sort of feedback from the community on the design of the API and the work that we're going to do to support more capabilities with workspaces. Today, like, the feature set we have is extremely limited. So yeah, essentially that work should probably get queued up, and we'll be working on workspaces, I would say, come again Q3 or sorry, like the beginning of next year. So that update is essentially we'll be working again on probably feature work in the next quarter, I would imagine. And we're still having discussions in the RFCs repo right now about what exactly that looks like. So there's like a phase 2 of work that we've queued up. So essentially, how you filter workspaces, how you run subcommands in workspaces is sort of that phase 2 of work.
Cool. I've added a workspaces phase 2 note here. Darcy, would you be cool with maybe fleshing that out into a little bit more of an issue? And then we don't need to slate it into any quarters right now, but like when we have it on quarterly planning, we can start doing that.
Yeah.
Cool. Roy, do you have anything to add about workspaces? I know you're like really in the mucky muck of it.
Yeah, maybe just that right now it was according to the plan. We're working on stabilizing. So yeah, we're acting on bug reports, etc.
Very cool. Thank you very much.
Cool.
So the next one we have on here is make it easier to install a package from a pull request. My understanding is you already can do this, but there were some interesting challenges that Gregor brought up here. Darcy or Roy, would either of you like to speak to this one?
I haven't looked through this. I'm not sure, Roy, have you had a chance to look through this yet?
No, not really.
So I can give the summary really quickly then, and then you can give me an answer. But the request was being able to install from a pull request, which with NPM 7 you can now do. So you can do pound pull / pull number. Here they're using the head, but you actually don't need to do that. That's just kind of like superfluous internal Git stuff that you could ignore. But the challenge that Gregor was running into is that works for a package that is not a workspace or a monorepo, and it also works for a package that doesn't like publish using like a special flow. But there are packages that some people use where they actually compile a whole folder or transpile a whole folder and then publish that folder rather than publishing the whole package. So the flow that we have right now with NPM doesn't really work. I think this is a good example of something that could be solved via like staged publishing or with GitHub Actions. Gregor and I actually went through and kind of talked about whether or not this could be done with using actions and GitHub packages. But right now you need to authenticate to install a GitHub package. So it's not really a solution. But if we find ourselves at a point where you can install GitHub packages or packages from other registries without requiring authentication with the CLI, then that could actually solve that problem, because you could have an action on a pull request that builds the package and publishes it. Some third parties have actually already been doing this to the main registry, but this creates a lot of noise, especially in the document, which is like an ongoing document that keeps like an update for every single publish of a package. And as that document gets larger and larger, it can actually slow down the install of a package. So if you were like publishing a version of your package multiple times for every single pull request, when we talk about like complexity theory and orders of magnitude, that just like exponentially blows up the number of publishes that you have. So that wouldn't be ideal for the public registry, but could be fine on something like GitHub packages. The there's also something to be said about like, should we be publishing code from other people in the namespace of like the official thing when it hasn't really been reviewed? But stepping back, I think that this is an interesting one where on the surface, it seems like it's kind of like a CLI problem, but the solution for it is probably one that comes from a combination of the registry or potentially even GitHub products. And this is one of those things that GitHub Auth could also really help with if we have kind of like a recipe, for lack of a better way of putting, of creating these kinds of previews. GitHub Auth could make this a little bit simpler.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, please.
Yeah, I think your initial like gut feel there in terms of this being facilitated by like actions or like GitHub product potentially, it makes a lot of sense. Like I imagine that we could create like a privileged or like NPM type GitHub action that supports this and essentially creates like artifacts. So like and then you essentially could be installing like the artifact, right? Like once the GitHub action had ran.
Oh, so like the GitHub action could make the tarball. It can upload that tarball in a comment with the like command to install it or something.
Exactly.
Like that.
And that's what Pika, I think, while they did it with their own like CDN, I think they had a feature like this where they would comment back on the PR with the how to install this. And we could do something the same where we have a GitHub action, again, like the NPM, publish PR or like stage PR action that essentially does all this work for you and then gives you the link to the artifact that then can be installed. And then that might facilitate this kind of workflow, but I think it might be out of the scope of the CLI itself, as you noted.
Cool. Well, I think with that, we've got about 4 minutes left. What I'd like to do really quickly is take a look at YouTube and see if we have any comments from anyone. So let's see, chat looks nice and empty. Great, that makes it easy for us. I think that with that being said, it might be good to just wrap up a little early instead of spending too much, like starting a topic that we don't get to finish. So I'd like to thank everyone from the team who found an hour of their day today to participate in this call. I'd like to thank everyone who dialed in. One last thought I'd like to bring up, and I will probably open a discussion about this. After the last meeting, Marav had asked about whether or not like the public was able to join, and that it actually would be useful for her. And sorry for putting words in your mouth, Marav, but I think this is an important point. That it'd be useful for you to be able to like ask questions live during these meetings, especially to the people who had open discussions that we were talking about. And I think Darcy, just this week, you had also thought maybe this call was going to be a little bit more open and not just to the team. So I guess like the two questions, and we don't need to answer them today, and I'll start a discussion for us to all talk about, would be one to the team. Do you find these meetings like productive the way they are right now? Do you think that bringing in more people would make the meeting less productive or more productive? And then I guess to the people at home and the people who are writing discussions, my question to you would be like, do you think that this format is very useful, or do you think a more interactive format, would be more beneficial? I don't know the answer to that. I think it's worth asking these questions. I also don't know if these meetings are going to be like permanent fixtures that we always do. We're kind of learning as we go here. So just kind of questioning the format. We have 2 minutes. Does anyone have any last minute thoughts about that before we wrap? Bueller? Okay, cool. Well, again, thank you everyone for dialing in.